On Saturday, the 23rd of November, this Civil Air Patrol aircraft crashed in the mountains of Colorado, just north of Drake, Colorado, while on a routine aerial photography mission. Here's what we know so far. My name's Juan Brown. You're watching the BLANCOLIRIO channel. This aircraft involved in the accident is a 2009 Cessna 182T. T does not mean turbocharged in this case, that's just the model number, but it is powered by the IO 540 Lycoming fuel-injected engine, putting out about 230 horsepower. The Colorado Civil Air Patrol is mourning the loss of the pilot, Susan Wolber, a very experienced Civil Air Patrol pilot, and aerial photographer Jay Roten, and seriously injured in the crash was co-pilot Randall Settergren. Looking at the preliminary ADS-B data from ADS-B Exchange, we see the aircraft departed Fort Collins Loveland Airport at about 16:58 and headed off to the west to do aerial photography practice here in the mountains at an altitude of 8,000 to 9,000 feet. And then it appears that on the way back, they decided to take some pictures just to the west of Palisade Mountain. The elevation of Palisade Mountain is about 8,000 feet, with the entire flight lasting about 1 hour and 14 minutes. Now, if we take this ADS-B data and again export it to Google Earth, we can get a better 3D view of the flight path. And if we spin around, we can take a look at the final moments of the flight behind Palisade Mountain. We can get an idea of just how steep that drop-off was the last few data points. If we go over to Zoom Earth and rewind the date back to 23 November, 11:10 a.m., about the time of the accident, we could see that there were some clouds in the area, higher clouds, and we can also take a look at the winds at the time. Fort Collins area reporting only 4 miles per hour out of the east-southeast, but in the mountains near the crash site, winds are typical out of the west-southwest at 19 to 20 miles per hour. If we put our Google map back in the north-up orientation and take a look at those winds from the west-southwest is going to put the accident aircraft right on the lee side of the mountain where your maximum downdrafts would occur. As the wind flows over the mountains, just like water in a stream, and can create quite turbulent airflow on the lee side of the mountains, especially when operating at low altitude. Now let's take a closer look at these ground speeds of the mission flight. Susan's ground speeds are varying quite a bit, from 65 knots up to 123 knots as they work in and out of this headwind-tailwind condition in the mountains. And at the last couple of data points, we see her slow flying in here at about 89 knots, 85 knots in here. But then there's this steep turn right here, 65 knots, 55 knots, 41 knots, 36 knots. I mean, even with the winds aloft at the time, operating very, very close to the stalling speed of the aircraft. Remember, there's 3 people on board the Cessna 182, naturally aspirated. It's a cold day, but they're up here at 8,000 feet. You just don't have a lot of excess performance in a Cessna 182 at this elevation, even in these colder temperatures. 39 knots of ground speed, 41 knots of ground speed. And this slow flight regime continues. 81.75 on the altitude, 82.25, 82.75. She's hanging on to her altitude here, but continuing to fly very, very slow ground speeds. Let me scoot this over so you can see over here on the left. We'll not only take a look at the altitudes, but the rate of altitude change at these different data points. 82.25, 50 knots, climbing at 640 to 700 feet per minute, depending on which data you're looking at. Climbing 960, 640. So she's got quite a bit of lift going on here. She's climbing, trying to climb out of this altitude. 47 knots, 82.75. We're getting some conflict in the data here. Barometric rate says descending at 500 feet per minute. Geometric rate says climbing at 768 feet per minute. Barometric rate 2,496 feet per minute down. So right in here, they've lost control of the aircraft. Last data point, 3,000 feet per minute rate of descent. A loss of control of the aircraft. Directly downwind and very close to Palisade Mountain, elevation over 8,000 feet. An alert was sent out right after the crash, and a Colorado Army National Guard helicopter was able to respond quickly. Local TV Channel 9 news helicopter was up shortly after the crash and got these images. It looks to me like all four corners of the aircraft are located in a very close proximity to the crash site, indicating to me that, or corroborating the ADS-B data, that this was in fact a loss of control of the aircraft. It's very unlikely that this would be an in-flight breakup of the aircraft, especially at those sort of low airspeeds. It's simply not that easy to break up a Cessna 182 at lower airspeeds. Could it have been a possible engine failure? Investigators will be able to take a good look at the engine to try and determine if it was in operational condition at the time of the crash. And this appears to be one of the wings wrapped around this tree. Here's another view of that one wing wrapped around the tree. And as we look at the background here with the snow against the previously burned forest, we can get a sense of the idea of how hard it is for these Civil Air Patrol crews to find downed aircraft in these sort of snowy conditions. And these are the sort of things that these guys are training for constantly. In some cases, it would be like finding a needle in a haystack. But in this case, this fuselage is still pretty well intact. Fully 20% of general aviation accidents occur while maneuvering at low altitudes. And of course, everybody knows that your stall speed increases with increased angle of bank, particularly when you're trying to maintain your altitude. You're not giving up your altitude for airspeed. And in low-level aerial photography, you've always got a photographer that wants you to get lower and slower and closer to the target. In Alaska, this sort of accident is so common, it's got the name moose stalls. Hunters and pilots orbiting over a fixed point, like a moose, for example, and then stalling the aircraft because they're so fixated on the target. In Texas, I hear they call them coyote stalls because you're orbiting over a coyote or some fixed object and losing control of the aircraft. And as we all know, an aircraft can stall at any airspeed or any attitude, but only one critical angle of attack. So is an angle of attack indicator part of the solution? Well, maybe. To really drive the point home is this classic old video that's commonly used for training video now. I first saw this video back when I was training up in the U.S. Forest Service to be a lead plane pilot. The L-19E crash near Tabernash, Colorado. Now, this was a situation more with density altitude with this aircraft, but he's attempting to get himself out of a bowl that he managed to get himself into. Now, this is summertime in the mountains of Colorado. So this pilot continues to maneuver up this bowl and get closer and closer to the terrain. Yeah, this bowl here, until at this point here, he decides he's getting too close and he needs to turn around and get out of there. He ends up turning into higher terrain and stalling the aircraft and losing control, spinning in. Getting closer to the terrain. Decides to make a turn to the right into rising terrain. There's the stall warning horn, increased bank angle, stall, into the trees. And it happens just that quick. But Susan knows all this. She's a very experienced Civil Air Patrol pilot flying in this mountainous terrain. It looks like she's been doing it for at least 25 years What drives an experienced pilot to get themselves boxed into a situation like this? Is it complacency over time? And these last couple of data points, is she poking her nose back into this box canyon situation in an effort to get one more photo shoot? Or did she poke her nose in here and try to make the decision to escape? Is she going full power and trying to get out of this situation? We may never know the answer to this, and we'll rely on a large part on what the surviving co-pilot, Randy, has to say about this situation in an effort to get to the bottom as to exactly what happened to this Civil Air Patrol flight. Thank you so much for your support of this channel, especially the folks over on Patreon that make this content possible. See you here.